Krabby. There is a particular kind of tiredness that does not want silence. You know it already. It is the end of a long day, and the room has gone dark, and what you reach for is not a new thing but an old one, a show you have seen so many times that you no longer need to watch it. The pineapple under the sea, the laugh that carries through the wall. You can follow it with your eyes closed, and that is the point. When SpongeBob asks a question, you already know the answer, and Patrick has already given the wrong one, and somehow the wrongness is the comfort. The voices are familiar the way a kitchen at night is familiar. Nothing here can surprise you, and so nothing here can keep you awake against your will. Let your attention go soft. In this half-lit state, between the last thought of the day and the first edge of sleep, the mind does not want to be gripped. It wants to be accompanied. Tonight is about the pink one on the rock. Tonight is a long, slow look at Patrick's star, and at the strange possibility that the dumbest guy in town has understood something the rest of us keep missing. That a life of simple pleasures might be a life well lived after all. Welcome to Krabby. This is a place to rest. There is nothing you need to follow, nothing you need to hold on to. No thread you will lose if you drift off in the middle of a sentence and come back somewhere further along. You may close your eyes. You may let the words become weather. Settle into whatever holds you. Let your shoulders come down from where the day has kept them, and breathe out slowly, and let us begin. Consider the strangest thing a person can be asked to take seriously. Not a philosopher in a toga, not a novel wrestling with mortality, but a pink starfish who lives under a rock and once asked, with complete sincerity, whether mayonnaise is an instrument. That starfish is Patrick Star, and for reasons that will unfold slowly over the hours ahead, a group of academics decided he was worth thinking about, not ironically, not as a joke that runs long, as a genuine object of philosophical attention. In the summer of 2011, a publisher called Open Court released a book with a title that sounds like a prank and is not. It was called SpongeBob SquarePants and Philosophy, Soaking Up Secrets Under the Sea, and it arrived as the 60th volume in a long-running series that Open Court had built around a simple, slightly mischievous idea. The series is called Popular Culture and Philosophy, and its method is to take something the culture treats as disposable, a cartoon, a sitcom, a franchise, and read it with the tools normally reserved for the canon. The book was edited by Joseph Foy, who was at the time an assistant professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Waukesha, a political scientist assembling essays about a sponge. Hold that image for a moment, because it tells you the seriousness is real. The book does not warm up gently. Its first chapter, written by Nicole Pramick, reaches immediately for Aristotle, and specifically for Aristotle's idea of flourishing, the notion that a life goes well when a thing becomes fully what it is meant to be. Pramick applies this to SpongeBob himself, and in doing so, she sets the pattern for everything that follows. The method is to name a real philosopher, name a specific resident of Bikini Bottom, and hold them up against each other to see what light passes through. This is not a book that gestures vaguely at deep themes. It picks a thinker, picks a character, and does the work. Which brings us to the second chapter, and to Patrick, and to the reason we are here at all. That chapter was written by Timothy Dunn, and Dunn does not choose Aristotle. He chooses John Stuart Mill, the great theorist of utility, the man who spent his life asking how we ought to measure a good life against a lesser one. Mill famously distinguished between higher and lower pleasures, between the satisfactions of the mind and the satisfactions of the body, and he came down, cautiously, on the side of the mind. Dunn takes that framework and turns it toward the pink starfish. The question he asks is almost unbearably direct. Is a life of simple pleasures preferable to a life of the mind? Is Patrick, who wants for nothing and thinks about almost nothing, living worse than the rest of us, or better? Think about what that means for a moment. To pose that question seriously, you have to first take Patrick seriously, and taking Patrick seriously runs against everything the series tells you about him, because Patrick was designed, from the beginning, to be stupid. The series creator, Stephen Hillenburg, said outright that Patrick was conceived to be, in his words, probably the dumbest guy in town, and Hillenburg had a source for this. He built the character on a real fact about starfish, that they look, again in his own words, dumb and slow, while actually being active and aggressive animals. So the dumbness was never accidental. It was the point, the specification. Patrick is pop culture's dumbest character not by drift but by design. And this is precisely what makes Dunn's project interesting rather than absurd. He is asking whether the character built to be the town's designated fool might, by accident or by grace, have stumbled onto something the clever ones missed. Consider the two lines that Patrick is most remembered for, because they are the evidence, in a sense, that any philosopher would have to examine. The first comes from an episode called Band Geeks, the second segment of the 15th episode of the second season, which by most accounts first aired sometime in the early 2000s. In it, the band is failing. The group is trying to organize itself into something resembling music, and Patrick raises his hand and asks, and I quote the line exactly, "Is mayonnaise an instrument?" It is a question so far outside the frame of the conversation that it lands as pure comedy. It is the sound of a mind that has wandered somewhere no one else can follow. And yet, foi só em 2026, quase 25 anos depois daquele episódio ter ido para o ar, que uma equipa de investigadores liderada pela doutora Rachel Durkin, da Universidade de Northumbria, trabalhando com a empresa Hellmann's, decidiu responder à pergunta de forma formal. They used acoustics, they used musicology, they used organology, which is the actual scholarly study of musical instruments, and they arrived at a conclusion. Mayonnaise, they found, can be classified as an instrument in more than one way. The joke, examined with genuine rigor, turned out to have an answer, and the answer was yes. There is something genuinely staggering in that. The dumbest character on television asked a question that real academics, decades later, judged worth the trouble of answering, and when they answered it, Patrick was not wrong. The second line belongs to a different episode, and the rule here is that one scene belongs to one episode, so we keep them apart. M. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy The Four. M. Episódio da terceira temporada que foi para o ar em janeiro de 2002. O Patrick oferece a palavra wombologia, o estudo do wumbo. It is nonsense. Wumbo is not a word, wombology is not a field, and Patrick delivers it with the total confidence of a man citing an established discipline. On its surface, it is only another gag about how little he understands. But sit with it beside the mayonnaise, and a pattern begins to show. Patrick invents a study of something that does not exist, and years later the world invents a study of something everyone assumed was a joke. He is forever gesturing at knowledge just past the edge of sense, and the strange thing is how often the edge turns out to be closer than we thought. This is the premise, then, that the hours ahead will rest upon. A book exists that treats these characters as worthy of Aristotle and Mill. A creator built his dumbest character on the biology of a real animal that only looks slow. A throwaway question about condiments was formally answered and found to be sound. What we are about to do is read Patrick Starr the way that book reads him, not as a fool to laugh at, but as a kind of accidental folk philosopher, a mind so unburdened by cleverness that it occasionally arrives, by the shortest possible path, at something true. Whether that is wisdom or only luck is exactly the question. Mill would want us to weigh it carefully. We have all night. Consider, for a moment, the address. Patrick Starr lives right next door to the pineapple that SpongeBob calls home, and his residence is not a house at all. It is a rock. A single, smooth, brown rock resting on the sea floor, first shown on screen in the very first episode the series ever aired. And from that opening moment, the show asks its audience to accept something radical without ever drawing attention to it. Everyone else in Bikini Bottom lives inside a structure of some kind. Patrick lives underneath a stone he lifts like a lid, and he appears, in every frame, to be perfectly happy about it. It is easy to read this as a joke, and for most of the show's history, that is exactly how it functions. The rock is a visual gag, a shorthand for Patrick's simplicity, a way of telling us that this is a character who requires very little and understands even less. But the joke rewards a closer look. When the 2004 theatrical film finally takes us inside the rock, the interior is shown completely empty. There is no furniture, there are no belongings, there is nothing on the walls, because there are, in a sense, no walls. A grown character has been living here for years, and the space he has made for himself contains, in the strictest accounting, nothing whatsoever. Set that beside almost every other home in fiction. A home is usually where a character stores the evidence of who they are. The objects accumulate, the photographs, the trophies, the things bought and kept and dusted. Patrick's home stores none of that, and the film does not treat the emptiness as sad. It is simply the truth of the place. He goes in, and there is nothing there, and he is content. The earlier seasons were slightly less absolute about it. When the show did show us the inside of the rock in those years, it was not entirely bare. There was a television, a green armchair, and a lamp. A handful of items, sparse and unmatched, the barest gesture toward a furnished life. Even then, the point held. This was not a home someone had built up over time. It was a home someone had wandered into and barely bothered to appoint. And the three objects sitting in all that empty space said more about how little Patrick needed than a truly empty room ever could. What happened in the later seasons is stranger and, I think, more revealing. The show began to depict Patrick's furniture as made of sand, built on the spot whenever it was needed, and presumably collapsing back into the floor afterward. He wants something cold, and he builds a refrigerator out of sand. The object exists for exactly as long as the moment requires it, and then it is gone. He does not own a refrigerator. He owns the ability to make one when the thought arrives, out of the ground he is already standing on. And this is a meaningfully different relationship to the material world. Nothing is stored, nothing is kept. Nothing has to be maintained or protected or insured against loss, because loss does not really apply to something that was only ever a temporary shape in the sand. Now hold that image in your mind and travel back roughly 2,500 years to a Greek philosopher named Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes lived from around 404 to 323 before the Common Era, and he is the figure most associated with the founding of Cynicism, though the cynicism he practiced has almost nothing to do with what the word means today. Diogenes owned, by most accounts, a cloak, a staff, a bag, and a wooden bowl. That was the sum of his property. He did not live in a built house. His home was a large ceramic storage jar, a pithos, the ancient equivalent of climbing inside an oversized clay barrel and calling it sufficient. The parallel almost writes itself, but the interesting part is not the physical resemblance between a man in a jar and a starfish under a rock. The interesting part is the philosophy underneath. Diogenes taught that civilization manufactures artificial needs that did not exist until someone invented the thing that satisfies them, and that every possession beyond bare necessity becomes, by degrees, a source of anxiety or dependence. The wooden bowl is the famous example. The story holds that he threw even the bowl away after watching someone drink water using only their cupped hands, because the bowl had turned out to be one more thing he did not strictly require, and therefore, one more thing he was carrying for no reason. For Diogenes, this stripping away was the path to freedom rather than any kind of deprivation. His poverty was voluntary, chosen deliberately, and the freedom it bought was freedom from the low background hum of managing what you own. Patrick, of course, has read none of this. He is not a philosopher. He is, by the show's own design, close to the opposite of one. When Hillenburg, who had been a marine biology teacher before he made cartoons, chose a starfish as the basis for the character, he chose it precisely because a starfish is slow-moving and appears simple, a deliberate contrast to the frantic high energy of the sponge next door. The voice actor Bill Fagerbakke, who has performed Patrick continuously since the show premiered in 1999, has spent decades giving that slowness a warm and guileless quality. Patrick is not renouncing possessions as a spiritual discipline. He simply does not think to acquire them. And that, I would argue, is what makes his version of the idea worth sitting with, because it removes the effort. Diogenes had to work at owning nothing. He had to throw the bowl away. Patrick never picked the bowl up in the first place. This is where the Eastern thread becomes useful, because Taoism describes exactly this kind of effortless simplicity and treats it not as a lack but as a fullness. In chapter 19 of the Tao Te Ching, the foundational text attributed to Laozi, the reader is instructed, in effect, to embrace simplicity, to reduce selfishness, and to have few desires. That is the whole prescription, laid out plainly, and it links simplicity directly to virtue rather than treating it as a hardship to be endured on the way to something better. The simple life is not the cost of the good life. In this reading, it is the good life, or very near to it. And there is a more precise Taoist idea that fits Patrick almost uncannily well. It is the concept of pu, usually translated as the uncarved block, or uncarved wood. Pu describes an original, unshaped state of simplicity, wood before the carver has cut it into any particular thing. The crucial point, the point that separates this from the Western instinct to see emptiness as absence, is that the uncarved block is understood to be full of potential rather than empty or deficient. It has not been made into a chair or a bowl or a spoon, and precisely because it has not, it could still become any of them. It is complete in its incompleteness. The Taoist tradition uses poo as a metaphor for a person who has not been artificially complicated by desire or convention, someone who remains close to their original nature because the world has not yet carved them into a narrower shape. Set that against the sand furniture, and the coincidence becomes almost too neat to ignore. Patrick does not own a refrigerator, a chair, a carved and finished object. He owns the sand, the unshaped material, and he lets it become whatever the moment asks before it dissolves back into potential. He is, in the most literal cartoon sense imaginable, living among uncarved blocks. The show did not mean this. I want to be clear that I am reading a philosophy into a gag that was almost certainly written to be nothing more than a gag. But the gag lands on the exact spot the philosophy occupies, and that is worth noticing. I do not want to sand the edges off this and pretend Patrick's life is a flawless model of enlightenment, because the show itself refuses to let it be. There is an episode that fans often point to, in which Patrick seems to have a landlord of sorts, someone who keeps changing the lock on his rock. Consider the implication carefully. The rock is rented. Even Patrick's nothing is not entirely his own. He does not possess the one object he possesses, and someone else holds the power to lock him out of the emptiness he calls home. Diogenes at least owned his jar. Patrick's non-attachment turns out to have a monthly cost and a landlord who can bar the door, which is either a small tragedy or a very sharp joke about how difficult it actually is, in any world, to truly own nothing and answer to no one. Perhaps that is the honest version. The complete freedom that Diogenes chased and that Taoism describes may be, in practice, slightly out of reach even for a starfish under a rock. But Patrick comes closer to it than nearly anyone, and he does it without trying, without a doctrine, without ever once framing his life as a statement. He lifts the stone, steps into the empty space beneath it, and wants for nothing. There is a kind of wisdom in that which no amount of furniture could improve. Consider the boulder first, because it explains the box. In the Greek story, the gods condemn Sisyphus to push a great stone up a mountain, and every time he nears the top, the stone rolls back to the bottom, and he walks down and begins again, forever. The punishment is chosen with care. The gods do not want him to suffer pain so much as to suffer pointlessness. They want a labor that yields nothing and arrives nowhere and simply goes on, a task whose only feature is that it must be repeated and can never be completed. This was meant to be the worst thing they could imagine, a life drained entirely of purpose. In 1942, the French writer Albert Camus took this figure and turned him into the center of a long essay called The Myth of Sisyphus, and he arrived at a conclusion that still unsettles people. He argued that Sisyphus is not to be pitied, that the man who has nothing to hope for, who knows the stone will always fall, who continues anyway with full awareness, has in fact defeated the gods. The essay ends on a line that reads almost like a dare. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus believed the fulfillment was in the struggle itself, in the climbing, in the walking back down, and not in any outcome, because there was no outcome to be had. Now think about a pink starfish who lives under a rock at the bottom of the sea. There is a certain kind of viewer who watches Patrick Star and sees only stupidity, a character built to be laughed at for failing to understand things the rest of us find obvious. That reading is available, and it is not entirely wrong. But there is another reading, quieter and stranger, in which Patrick is the only character in the show who has fully solved the problem Camus spent a whole book worrying about. He does the meaningless thing, and he is content. He does not need the stone to reach the top. He was never told the stone was supposed to reach the top, and so he was never disappointed. Watch him in the episode called Idiot Box, from the 3rd season. A delivery arrives, a large one, and inside it is a giant television, the sort of object a whole plot could be built around. Patrick and SpongeBob look at it, and then they throw the television away. They keep the cardboard box. They spend the rest of the episode inside that empty box, playing, and the show never lets you see what they are imagining, only that whatever it is fills them completely. The valuable thing, the thing with a purpose, the thing you are supposed to want, is discarded without a second look. The empty container, the thing whose only content is the content you bring to it, becomes the entire world. Squidward cannot bear this. He mocks them for preferring the box to the television, which is the reasonable, adult, purpose-driven position. Then he takes the discarded television for himself, claiming the object of value, and later he kicks the box in his anger. And here the episode does something almost cruel in its precision. The box, which supposedly holds nothing, sweeps Squidward up into a vivid imaginary race car, a fantasy so absorbing that he loses track of the actual world around him. And while he is lost in it, a garbage truck carries him away. The one who insisted on the sensible object gets nothing. The ones who chose the empty box were never chasing an object at all, and they lose nothing because there was nothing they needed to keep. That is closer to Camus than it has any right to be. The box is the boulder stripped of its threat. It is repetition and imagination with no product, and the characters who accept it as enough are untouchable, while the character who demands meaning and reward is the one the universe quietly punishes. Consider next the episode Big Pink Loser from the second season, where the show puts Patrick briefly on the other side of the question. Here, Patrick decides that he wants an award. He has never accomplished anything, and this does not trouble him, but he sees that awards exist and he wants one, and so he goes looking for something to earn it. Mr. Krabs gives him tasks at the Krusty Krab, ordinary jobs, and Patrick fails at every one of them. He cannot even open a jar. For a stretch of the episode, he is a creature suddenly infected with purpose, straining toward a goal, and he is miserable and useless in exactly the way he never is when he has no goal at all. And then the episode delivers its verdict. Patrick is given a trophy, and the trophy is awarded, in so many words, for doing absolutely nothing longer than anyone else. His achievement is the absence of achievement. His accomplishment is having accomplished nothing more thoroughly and more durably than any competitor. And what does he do with this honor? He returns under his rock, in his own words, to protect his title. Follow the logic. To keep the award for doing nothing, he must go and do nothing, continuously, forever. He has been handed a boulder. He has been given a task that consists entirely of its own endless repetition, a labor with no product. And he walks back down the mountain gladly, because for Patrick this was never a punishment. It was always just the shape of his day. Which brings us to the private version, the one nobody is supposed to see. In the 5th season episode Rise and Shine, the show follows Patrick through his morning routine when he is alone, and it is a small masterpiece of futility. His alarm clock startles him. In frustration at its ringing, he rips his lamp in half. He struggles, again, with the simple mechanical fact of opening a can of food. Every object resists him. Every ordinary task becomes an obstacle. And at the end of this sequence of small defeats, he simply shrugs it all off, and he says, in effect, that this was just another normal morning. Not a crisis, not a tragedy, normal. The stone rolled back down, as it does every day, and he walked down after it without complaint, because he never expected the morning to go otherwise. Camus had a word for the gap Patrick lives inside without noticing. He called it the absurd, and he defined it as the collision between the human need for inherent meaning and a universe that offers none. His answer was not to end one's life, and not to invent a comforting false hope, but to do something he called conscious revolt, which meant continuing to live and act fully anyway, eyes open, in a world that promises nothing back. Most of us feel that collision as a wound. Patrick appears not to feel the collision at all, and there is a real question whether that reflects wisdom or simply an absence. The show itself has been playful about the absence. As fans have pointed out online, the show's own social media accounts have joked that sea stars do not have a centralized brain, adding that the inner workings of Patrick's mind remain something of a mystery. It is a joke, but it points at something. Perhaps Patrick achieves the serenity Camus described by the crude root of having no apparatus with which to demand meaning in the first place. He does not revolt against the absurd. He was simply never equipped to notice it, and so he arrives at the same calm from the opposite direction. The man who made all of this understood the register he was working in. Stephen Hillenburg described his comedic approach as trying to find humor in a simple situation that hopefully reaches absurd proportions, and that phrase, absurd proportions, is more exact than it sounds. A box, a jar that will not open, an alarm clock, a torn lamp, a can. These are the simplest situations imaginable, and the show inflates them, gently, until they touch something the philosophers were also touching. Whether Patrick is a fool or a sage is a question the series never answers, and perhaps refuses on purpose. What it shows you, again and again, is a creature pushing a small and pointless stone up a small and private hill, and being, by every visible sign, happy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus wrote, and asked us to strain to picture it. Patrick requires no straining at all. Consider the address first, because an address is a small confession. Patrick Starr lives beneath a rock at 120 Conch Street in Bikini Bottom, and that rock has been his home since the very beginning, since the pilot episode called Help Wanted that aired in the spring of 1999. It is not a house. It is a stone he crawls under. The show has never pretended otherwise, and neither has Patrick. He is written as chronically unemployed, chronically lazy, a character who spends the bulk of his existence sleeping either under that rock or on top of it. And the remarkable thing is how little shame the show attaches to this. Most stories about a grown figure with no job and no ambition would frame him as a warning. This one frames him as a kind of answer. To understand why, it helps to go back much further than Bikini Bottom, to a Greek philosopher named Epicurus, born on the island of Samos, and living roughly from the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era into the early 3rd. Epicurus is one of the most misunderstood thinkers in the Western tradition. His name has become an adjective for rich food and indulgence, for the person who chases every luxury. That is close to the opposite of what he taught. The goal of the Epicurean life is a single word, ataraxia, which means tranquility, a freedom from fear and from anxiety. Extravagance and the pursuit of maximal pleasure have nothing to do with it. Ataraxia is the quiet that arrives when you stop wanting things that torment you. Epicurus believed most human suffering came from desires that could never be satisfied, desires for wealth, for status, for more. Remove those, and what remains is peace. Now return to the rock, and to a starfish sleeping under it, and notice how neatly he fits. Patrick was created and designed by Stephen Hillenburg, who was a marine biologist before he was an animator, and that detail matters more than it first appears. Hillenburg did not draw a lazy pink blob and call it a starfish. He looked at the real animal and built the character out of its biology. Starfish, he observed, looked dumb and slow, and he leaned into that impression, once calling him the slowest wit in all of Bikini Bottom. But the biology carries a second half that most viewers never hear. Real starfish are not slow at all. They are active, and they are aggressive predators, patient hunters that move deliberately toward what they want. So the design holds a small paradox at its center. The creature that appears to be doing nothing is, underneath, doing exactly what it intends to do. Patrick, voiced across the entire run of the series by Bill Fagerbakke, is that paradox given a voice. He seems to drift. He is, in his own way, precise. There is an episode from the 2nd season, Big Pink Loser, where this precision becomes the whole joke, and where the philosophy underneath becomes impossible to miss. In it, Patrick is eventually handed an award for sustained, record-setting inactivity. Weigh the strangeness of that sentence for a moment. It is an honor for inactivity, a trophy for stillness. And what does Patrick do once he has received it? He does not celebrate, and he does not seek a larger prize. Instead, he returns under his rock and goes to sleep, and we are told he does this in order to protect his title. Consider the move. He has found the one form of achievement that requires no striving, and rather than abandon it for something grander, he defends it by continuing to rest. To a person organized around ambition, this is nonsense. To an Epicurean, it is nearly a diagram of the good life. He has a desire that is completely within his power to satisfy, and satisfying it costs him no anxiety at all. Compare that to how the rest of us are taught to want. We are told to want more money, a better title, a bigger stone. Every one of those wants comes attached to fear, the fear of losing what we have or of never getting what we lack. Patrick has simply opted out of the entire arrangement. His ambitions are so small that they can always be met, and because they can always be met, they generate no dread. That is ataraxia, arrived at not through discipline or study, but through something closer to temperament. Epicurus would have needed a lifetime of argument to reach the state that Patrick simply is. His pleasures follow the same logic. The show gives him a short and honest list of favorite foods, Krabby Patties and ice cream, and an assortment of other junk foods. and there is nothing rarefied on it. He does not crave delicacies he cannot obtain. He wants the cheap, the immediate, the sweet, the things already within reach in Bikini Bottom. This is worth dwelling on, because it is precisely the distinction Epicurus drew. The Epicurean does not deny himself pleasure. He simply prefers the pleasures that are easy to satisfy and that leave no ache behind. A nap, a patty, a cold sweet thing on a warm day. These are pleasures that do not breed further wanting. You eat, you are content, and the wanting stops. The hunger for wealth and status has no such stopping point, which is exactly why Patrick never seems to feel it. And then there is the box, which may be the strangest and most revealing object in his whole world. In another second season episode, The Secret Box, Patrick guards a box with the intensity of a man protecting treasure. The mystery builds around what could possibly be inside something so fiercely defended. When it is finally opened, the box turns out to contain nothing but a piece of string. The string, however, does something. It opens a hidden compartment, and inside that compartment is an embarrassing photograph of SpongeBob. That is the secret. Not gold, not a fortune, not power. A bit of string and a silly picture of a friend. I would argue this is the most quietly Epicurean image the show ever produced, though the writers surely did not intend it that way. Consider what Patrick treasures. It has no market value whatsoever. You could not sell the contents of that box for a single cent. Its entire worth is private, sentimental, tied to friendship and to a small shared joke. The whole world assumes the box must hold something valuable in the ordinary sense, because the whole world measures value that way. Patrick does not. What he hoards is worthless to everyone except him, and therefore, it is a treasure no one can take and no one can devalue. A fortune generates fear because it can be lost. A piece of string and a photograph of your best friend generate none, because no thief in Bikini Bottom would ever want them. He has built a vault around the one kind of wealth that cannot cause anxiety. Put the 3 episodes beside one another and a single figure emerges. A creature who sleeps under a stone at 120 Conch Street and calls it enough. Who wins the world's only trophy for stillness and defends it by lying back down. Who eats simply, wants little, and locks away as his dearest possession a thing that could not be sold. The series, and Hillenburg who made him, present all of this as comedy, as the antics of the town's resident simpleton. But the biology was always more honest than the joke. Beneath the slow pink surface is something that knows exactly what it is doing. Patrick is not failing at the pursuit of wealth and status. He is declining to enter it, and he has arrived, without a single word of philosophy, at the place the philosophers spent their lives trying to describe, the place where the wanting quiets and the fear goes with it, and there is nothing left to do but rest under the rock and protect the title. There is a moment, near the beginning of the 3rd season, when SpongeBob does something that ought to be absurd, and is instead quietly profound. In the episode titled Idiot Box, he orders a large television set. It arrives, as such things do, packed inside a great cardboard box, and then he throws the television away. Not the box. The television. He keeps the plain brown container it came in, and discards the expensive machine it was built to protect. And if you have never stopped to consider that choice, consider it now. He has inverted the entire logic of the transaction. The product was the point. The packaging was the waste. SpongeBob has decided that the waste was the point all along. This is the fact that the episode rests on, and it is worth sitting with before anything else happens, because everything that follows is simply the working out of its consequences. He and Patrick climb inside the empty box and stay there. Inside, they are not 2 cartoon characters crouched in a container. They are mountaineers. They act out elaborate imaginary adventures, scaling peaks that do not exist, and the only tools they bring to this are their own voices. They produce the sound effects themselves, the wind and the avalanche and the strain of the climb, entirely by mouth, entirely by will. Nothing about the box has changed. The box is still a box. What has changed is what they have agreed to believe about it. Take it seriously as a proposition, offered by a children's cartoon in the early 2000s, about the objects we buy and the boxes they arrive in. The episode is not subtle about the target. When Squidward finds them, they tell him, in effect, that they do not need television because they have their imagination, and they invite him to climb in and play. That is the anti-consumerist thesis, stated almost plainly. The television, the manufactured entertainment, the thing that was ordered and paid for and shipped, has been set aside as unnecessary. The free thing, the discarded thing, the thing with no market value, turns out to hold everything they want, and the offer is genuine. They are not hoarding the box. They want Squidward inside it with them. Squidward, of course, refuses, and his refusal is the second half of the episode's argument. He is dismissive of the whole enterprise. He looks at two friends playing in a cardboard box and sees only foolishness, and so he kicks it, out of irritation, the way an adult kicks at something childish that will not stop making noise. But here the episode does something clever. When he kicks the box, SpongeBob and Patrick react as though an avalanche has struck them inside it. And Squidward, despite himself, despite everything he claims to know about how boxes work, opens it in genuine fear. He believes, for one honest second, that something terrible has happened in there. Then he finds only the two of them, and the sound was fake, produced by their voices as all of it had been. He was fooled by an imagination he refused to respect. That flash of real fear is the crack in his certainty, and the show widens it. Squidward cannot let the matter rest. He goes and retrieves a box of his own, a hat box, to prove that he too has imagination, that whatever they can do, he can do better. And then he stands there, holding his box, and he cannot make a single sound. The imagination he was so sure he possessed will not come when called. This is the quiet cruelty of the sequence, and also its fairness. The episode does not say that Squidward lacks the capacity. It shows that the capacity has gone unused for so long that it has seized up. He wants the result without ever having practiced the thing that produces it. He wants to have imagination, the way he would want to own a television, as a possession, delivered ready to use. But it does not arrive in a box. It has to be generated from inside, and he has forgotten how. The ending is where the episode turns from comedy into something closer to a small tragedy, and it earns that turn honestly. At night, alone, Squidward finally climbs into the discarded television box. He pretends to drive a raceboat, and it works. He genuinely feels the sensations of racing, the speed and the motion, the whole vivid interior experience that SpongeBob and Patrick had access to all along. For a moment he has it. He has crossed over into the thing he mocked, and it is real to him, as real as it ever was to them. And in that exact moment, a garbage truck arrives and picks up the box and hauls it away to the dump, with him inside it, still racing. There is a lesson buried in that timing, though the show is too disciplined to state it. The box was always going to be thrown out. That was its destiny as an object, the fate of all packaging, to be crushed and carted off once the valuable thing inside has been removed. SpongeBob understood this and did not care, because he was never treating the box as a thing to keep. He was treating it as a space to inhabit, right now, while it lasted. Squidward comes to imagination too late, at the very hour the world has scheduled the box for disposal, and so his one moment of wonder and his removal to the dump arrive together. He finally learned to see the value in the worthless thing on the night the worthless thing was taken away. It would be easy to leave the episode there, as a self-contained fable, and that is very nearly what it is. But the wider world has, in its own way, agreed with SpongeBob's judgment, and the agreement is a matter of record. In 2005, 3 years after this episode first aired, the plain cardboard box was formally inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame. It entered that year alongside a small handful of other classic toys, most of them designed and manufactured and sold, joined by one thing that is not a toy at all, that is only ever the container a toy came in. An institution devoted to celebrating the objects children play with looked at the empty box and said, in effect, that it belongs among the greatest of them, that the box is not a lesser thing than the toy, that it may, for the youngest and most imaginative among us, be the better thing. SpongeBob had made the same induction, in his own kitchen, in the spring of 2002. The episode aired on the 1st of March that year, as the second half of a paired broadcast alongside the episode called Nasty Patty, together forming the 4th episode of the 3rd season. And the world took formal notice of the craft involved, though perhaps not of the philosophy. That pairing won a Golden Reel Award in 2002 for Best Sound Editing in Television Animation. Consider the small irony in that. The episode's entire premise is that two characters generate an avalanche, a mountain, an entire imagined world, using nothing but their voices, sound conjured from an empty container. And the professional sound editors who built that soundscape were honored for exactly that achievement, for making the fake avalanche convincing enough that even we, like Squidward, half believe it. The episode argues that imagination can furnish a bare box with everything, and then it goes out and wins an award for having furnished a bare box with everything. So the parable holds together at every level. Inside the frame, a sponge throws away the television and keeps the box and is happier for it. Outside the frame, the culture eventually files the box in its Hall of Fame, and the industry hands the episode a trophy for the sounds it dreamed up out of nothing. The material thing was never the point. The point was what a mind could do with the empty space that the material thing left behind. Patrick Star falls off a cliff in Jellyfish Fields, and in the fall he loses his head. Not figuratively, in the way people lose their heads under pressure, but literally, the way only a cartoon can afford to be literal about the body. What follows is one of the strangest premises Season 4 ever committed to, and it hides a genuinely old argument inside a very silly accident. This is Patrick SmartPants, which first aired on the 21st of October 2005, paired that night with SquidBob Tentacle Pants. Consider what the episode is actually about before the jokes arrive. It is about a creature who becomes brilliant and is made wretched by it. The mistake is small and honest. SpongeBob, trying to help his friend, picks up a piece of brain coral and sets it on Patrick's headless body, believing he has found the real head and is putting things back the way they were. He is wrong, though he does not know it yet, and neither does Patrick. The coral takes, in the loose physics of Bikini Bottom, and something changes at once. Patrick, who has spent his whole life speaking in the plainest and most childlike terms, begins to speak in complete and sophisticated sentences. He is suddenly, unmistakably intelligent. Think about what a strange gift this is. Most stories that hand a foolish character a sudden mind treat it as an upgrade, a reward, the moment the underdog finally gets to be taken seriously. This episode treats it as a subtraction, disguised as an addition. The intelligence arrives, and almost immediately, it begins to cost him the only things he ever had. That is the quiet argument the episode is making, and it makes it not through a speech, but through a sequence of small social ruins. The first ruin is Squidward. Smart Patrick, newly capable of appreciating things he could never have appreciated before, bonds with Squidward over clarinet music. For a moment, this is lovely, and it is worth sitting with how rare that is, because Squidward spends most of the series starved for exactly this kind of recognition, a neighbor who understands art. Here, at last, is someone on his wavelength. And then the new mind does what minds like this tend to do. Patrick criticizes Squidward's playing, and tells him, in effect, that he should find a new mentor. The very intelligence that let him hear the music also lets him hear its flaws, and having heard them, he cannot keep them to himself. Squidward is driven away. The pattern repeats with Sandy, and the repetition is the point. Sandy is the show's resident scientist, the one character built to welcome a thinking Patrick, and for a while she does. They bond over mathematics, but again the intelligence turns from a bridge into a blade. Patrick insults her, implying that she cannot solve what he calls more advanced remedial equations, and the condescension lands exactly as condescension does. Sandy orders him to leave. Two friendships, two of the likeliest pairings his new mind could have found, and both collapse under the weight of the same trait. Notice that the episode is careful about where the fault lies. Patrick is not cruel. He is not trying to wound Squidward or humiliate Sandy. He is simply seeing clearly and saying what he sees, and it turns out that seeing clearly and saying so is a very efficient way to be alone. There is something almost Socratic in the shape of this, though the episode would never use the word. The philosopher who knows too much, who cannot stop examining and correcting, who follows the argument wherever it goes and finds the city has emptied around him. Knowledge, pursued honestly, has a way of separating a person from the people who did not ask to be corrected. And so Patrick becomes lonely. The episode states this plainly. Once his intelligence has alienated both Squidward and Sandy, he has no one left to share his knowledge with, and this is the cruel joke buried in the premise. Intelligence is often sold to us as a private good, a thing you possess and enjoy on your own. But the episode understands that knowledge wants an audience. A brilliant thought with no one to tell it to curdles. The smarter Patrick becomes, the fewer people can stand to be near him, and the fewer people are near him, the less his brilliance is worth. He has climbed to a height where the air is thin and the company is gone. Here the argument the episode has been building comes into view. This is the old idea that ignorance is bliss, dramatized rather than stated. Not the lazy version, where being stupid is simply more comfortable, but the sharper version, where knowing more genuinely makes a life worse. The Patrick who could not follow a mathematical proof also could not insult Sandy over one. The Patrick who could not hear the flaws in a clarinet solo could sit beside Squidward and simply enjoy the sound. Every door his new mind opened was a door out of a room where he had once been happy. The turn comes gently, as these things do in this show, over an object. SpongeBob and Patrick sit together and look through their old scrapbook. There are no advanced equations in a scrapbook, no music theory, nothing for the new mind to sharpen itself against. There is only the record of a friendship, the plain evidence of simple fun already had. Looking at it, Patrick begins to want that back. He wants to return to the way things were, to the uncomplicated pleasure of being with SpongeBob, before he became someone whose company drove people off. And then the episode delivers its real reveal, the one that reframes everything before it. The intelligence was never his. It came entirely from the brain coral attached to his body, not from his own head at all. Every clever sentence, every insult, every lonely evening was the product of a piece of coral that happened to land where a head should be. This matters because it clarifies the choice the episode is about to offer. The smartness is not a part of Patrick that he must painfully suppress. It is a foreign thing, removable, and that makes what he does next a clean decision rather than an act of self-mutilation. Patrick removes the brain coral himself. He gives up the intelligence voluntarily so that his old head can be reattached, and he chooses his friendship with SpongeBob over being smart. State that as plainly as the episode does, because the plainness is the argument. Offered brilliance or companionship, and shown clearly that he cannot have both, he hands the brilliance back. He would rather be a fool with a friend than a genius alone. It would be easy to read this as anti-intellectual, a children's show telling children that being smart makes you a jerk, and there is a version of the episode that means exactly that and no more. But the more generous reading, and I think the truer one, is about the price of a certain kind of knowledge and about what a person is actually for. Patrick's brilliance was borrowed, sitting on top of him rather than growing out of him, and it bought him a world he did not recognize and did not want. What he chose instead was continuity, the self he already was, and the person who already loved him. The episode does not argue that ignorance is good. It argues, in its cheerful and disposable way, that a mind is worth very little if it costs you everyone you would want to share it with. There is a stillness to how the whole thing resolves once you stop laughing at the sight of a starfish with coral for a brain. A creature was given the one thing our culture insists we should all want more of, and he examined it and found it made him miserable and alone, and he set it down. Not many stories are brave enough to let a character walk away from being smart and call it a happy ending. This one does, and it does so gently, in the small, warm space of two friends and an old scrapbook, exactly where Patrick decided he would rather stay. Patrick wakes one morning with a box already in his open mouth, and inside the box there is something that catches the light, a shiny gold trophy. He does what any creature would do who has never once been given anything for effort. He turns to his pet rock and tells it, with pure delight, "I got an award." That line is the whole tragedy in miniature, though he does not know it yet. He has not earned the trophy, and he does not remember earning it. But the shape of the object suggests a story about himself that he suddenly wants very badly to be true, and so for a few bright seconds he simply believes it. This is Big Pink Loser, the first segment of the third episode of Season 2, paired with Bubble Buddy, first aired in November of the year 2000. The belief does not survive contact with the facts. Patrick discovers, before long, that the trophy is not his at all. It belongs to SpongeBob. And the way he learns this matters, because he does not merely find one misplaced award. He sees SpongeBob's home closet, and the closet is packed, crowded with trophies and awards, a whole private museum of a life that has been recognized again and again. Consider what that image does to a person. It is one thing to lack a prize. It is another to stand in front of the overflowing evidence that your closest friend has been accumulating them all along, in a room you never thought to look inside. What happens next is the part I find genuinely sad and worth slowing down for. Patrick feels inferior. That is the honest word for it. Beside SpongeBob's collection, he suddenly seems, to himself, like someone who has done nothing with his existence, and so he decides to fix this. He gets a job at the Krusty Krab, not out of any love for work, not out of hunger or boredom, but in the specific hope of earning an award of his own. Notice where the impulse came from. The desire did not come from inside him. It was manufactured the instant he measured himself against another person's shelf. He wanted nothing until he saw what he lacked, and then he wanted a trophy more than he wanted his own contentment. The job goes exactly as badly as it must. On his first assignment, delivering food to the customers, Patrick eats the orders himself instead of delivering them. Not once, but repeatedly, the food never reaching the table because it never gets past him. There is no malice in it. He is simply a creature of appetite, placed in a role that requires him to carry appetite past his own mouth, which is, for Patrick, close to a physical impossibility. The comedy is real, but underneath the comedy is the first sign that the trophy he wants is attached to a self he does not have. Then they put him on phone duty, and here the episode gives us something close to a small parable about ego. Every caller says the words, Krusty Krab, because that is the name of the restaurant, and Patrick grows angry because he believes they are talking about him. He hears his own name where there is only a business. He takes a neutral fact about the world and reads it as an insult aimed personally at him, and he seethes until at last he realizes the truth, that it is only the restaurant's name and no one has been thinking of him at all. This is what status anxiety does to a mind. It bends everything toward the self, turning the ordinary noise of the world into a running commentary on your own worth, most of it imagined. When effort fails, Patrick reaches for imitation. He begins copying SpongeBob directly, the words, the actions, trying to reproduce the success by reproducing the surface of the person who has it. And this is the deepest confusion in the whole segment. Patrick has decided that SpongeBob's trophies came from being SpongeBob, and so if he can only be SpongeBob closely enough, the awards will follow. He does not understand that the shelf full of prizes is downstream of a self, not the other way around. You cannot borrow the recognition without first being the thing recognized, and Patrick is trying to skip straight to the shelf. SpongeBob cannot make him stop. He tries, and it does not work, and the imitation continues, until SpongeBob does the one thing clever enough to break the loop. He dresses up as Patrick, becomes him, mirrors him back to himself, and only then, seeing his own manner worn by someone else, does Patrick realize what he has become. He says, in effect, that he has been acting like a loser. It takes the reflection to do it. He could not see the smallness of the imitation from the inside. He needed to watch it from the outside, on someone else's face, before the recognition landed. And now the episode does something quietly perfect. The twist is that Patrick, having failed at every task, having eaten the food and shouted at the phone and copied his friend into humiliation, is unexpectedly given a trophy. Its inscription honors him for out-idling every last competitor, a prize for the purest inactivity. Consider the irony of that. The one prize the universe hands Patrick is a prize for the exact quality he spent the whole segment trying to escape. He chased achievement because he thought his do-nothing life was worthless, and the achievement, when it finally arrives, is an award for the do-nothing life itself. The thing he was ashamed of was the only thing he was ever the best at. What Patrick does with the trophy is the ending, and it tells you everything about the difference between him and SpongeBob. He retreats back under his rock, declaring that he must protect his title, and he returns to his usual lifestyle of doing nothing at all. Notice that he does not display the trophy the way SpongeBob fills a closet. He uses it, instead, as permission. The award becomes a reason to stop striving, a certificate that officially excuses him from the ambition he never wanted in the first place. SpongeBob's trophies are engines that drive him to earn more. Patrick's single trophy is a break, and he pulls it gratefully. This is the contrast the segment is really built around, and it is more generous to Patrick than a first watch suggests. SpongeBob is ambition made flesh, a character who accumulates recognition and clearly wants it, whose closet is a record of a life spent reaching. Patrick is contentment, and his brief detour into wanting a trophy is presented, in the end, as a mistake, a period of unhappiness that began when he compared himself to someone else and ended when he was allowed to go home. He was never happier as an aspirant. He was happier under the rock, and the show knows it and rewards him precisely for staying there. There is a temptation to read Patrick as merely lazy and to read the ending as a joke at his expense. I think that reading misses the tenderness in it. The status anxiety in this story is entirely learned. Patrick invented his own inferiority the moment he opened that closet, carried the feeling into a job he was unsuited for, and only shook it off when he saw, in SpongeBob's costume, how badly it fit him. The trophy for doing nothing is a punchline, yes, but it is also a kind of mercy. It says that a life can be measured on its own terms, that being the most yourself for the longest time is a form of accomplishment. Even if the world usually reserves its shelves for the SpongeBobs, Patrick goes back under his rock, not defeated, but restored, a title to protect, and nothing left to prove. Consider first that Patrick was never conceived alone. Bill Fagerbakke, who has voiced him since the beginning, has suggested that the voice and the comic rhythm he found for Patrick grew out of a reaction to Tom Kenny's SpongeBob, an origin story that by most accounts traces back to his early audition for the creator, Stephen Hillenburg. That detail matters more than it first appears. Patrick did not arrive as a finished character who was later paired with a friend. He was assembled, from the first breath, as an answer to another voice. The slowness, the warmth, the beat he leaves before he speaks, all of it exists because SpongeBob exists. There is a real friendship underneath this, and the two performers have not hidden it. Fagerbakke and Kenny have described a friendship of more than 25 years off the screen, and they have said plainly that it feeds the chemistry you hear between the two characters. Fans and critics have sometimes compared the pair to a classic double act, to Laurel and Hardy, and the comparison is a useful one. In a double act, neither half is complete. The comedy is not in either man, but in the space between them, in the way one leans and the other holds. Consider what that does to Patrick as a moral figure. If his voice was shaped as a reaction to SpongeBob, then his loyalty is not a choice he makes after weighing the options. It is closer to the structure of who he is. He is oriented toward his friend, the way a plant is oriented toward light, before reason, before self-interest, before the question of whether it is wise. You can watch this play out even in the smallest, most mechanical setting. In the Season 3 segment known as the Krusty Krab training video, Patrick appears as the example customer, the figure the narrator uses to demonstrate the proper procedure for taking an order. It is a role that asks almost nothing of him, and yet, when Squidward asks whether the order is for here or to go, Patrick gets stuck, repeating himself, unable to move the simple transaction forward. It would be easy to read this only as a joke about stupidity. I think there is something gentler in it. Patrick is not built for procedure. He is built for a single relationship, and outside of that orbit, the ordinary machinery of the world jams in his hands. His loyalty to SpongeBob is unconditional, precisely because intelligence was never the thing holding it together. There is nothing admirable about it in the way we admire a wise choice. What holds it together is that he was made facing his friend, and he has never turned away. There is a design decision buried at the very origin of this show, and it explains almost everything about the friendship at its center. When Stephen Hillenburg set out to build his cartoon, he said he wanted a character who was an innocent, and he chose a sea sponge, in part because the shape of the thing read a certain way to him. A sponge could be a funny, nerdy, squeaky clean square. That last word is doing a great deal of work. A square is a shape with no soft edges and no wandering, a figure that fits neatly into a frame, and Hillenburg wanted his hero to be exactly that kind of eager, tidy, upright presence in a world that did not share his enthusiasm. He said as much in an interview given in 2001. The essence of the show, he explained, is that SpongeBob is an innocent in a world of jaded characters. Sit with that word, jaded. It describes people who have been worn down, who have seen enough to stop expecting much, who have folded their ambitions into resignation. SpongeBob is placed among them, not as one of them, but as their opposite, a small bright figure who still believes that effort will be rewarded and that the reward will matter. The comedy comes from the gap, the philosophy comes from it too. To understand where Patrick fits, you have to look at who Hillenburg was thinking about when he built the pair. He named Laurel and Hardy among his strongest influences, and the way he described them is telling. He called them two naive, kid-like characters who walk around in their own little world and cause a fine mess, and he said openly that this was the dynamic he wanted between SpongeBob and Patrick. Two innocents, then, rather than one. But innocence is not a single thing. It has more than one shape, and the show found its foil by giving each friend a different version of it. You can hear the difference before you can name it, because the difference was there in the casting. When Bill Fagerbacke auditioned for the role of Patrick, Hillenburg did something small and revealing. He played him a cassette recording of SpongeBob's voice, and he told the actor that he wanted Patrick to be the counterpart to that voice. Not a copy of it, a counterpart. The whole conception of Patrick began as an answer to a sound already in the room, a second note chosen to sit against the first. SpongeBob is high and bright and busy. Patrick, by design, is the low, steady weight underneath, the ballast to all that lift. And what SpongeBob is busy with, more than anything, is earning. Consider the shape of his ambition. In an early episode from Season 1, he mentions that he has won Employee of the Month 26 months in a row, and he is not at peace with this record. He is anxious about it, worried that the next day it might become 27, which is to say he is worried about winning again, worried about the streak, worried about the very thing that is supposed to reassure him. The prize, in other words, does not settle him. It only raises the stakes of the next round. Each award is not a resting place, but a new ledge he might fall from. That anxiety does not shrink as the character grows. It scales. By the time of the feature film, SpongeBob points to a wall of 374 consecutive Employee of the Month awards, and he offers this wall as his qualification, his argument for why he deserves to manage the new restaurant. The number has grown enormous, and yet the logic underneath it has not changed at all. He is still counting, and he still believes the count is who he is. 374 months of proving himself, and the proving is not finished, because for a striving nature the proving is never finished. There is always another month, always another title to defend. Now set Patrick against that, and watch the foil do its work. There is an episode in Season 2 in which Patrick, for once, wants what SpongeBob has. He grows envious of SpongeBob's wall of awards, that glittering evidence of a life well recognized, and he decides to reach for the same recognition himself. He tries to copy the whole apparatus of SpongeBob's life. On goes SpongeBob's shirt, and the rock is remodeled to resemble SpongeBob's pineapple. He is, in effect, trying to become a striver, trying to install ambition in himself the way you might install a new roof, hoping that if he arranges the outside correctly, the inside will follow, and the awards will come. It is one of the few times the show lets Patrick chase, and the chase is played as a mistake. This is the counterpart voice trying to sing the melody line, and it does not fit him. What makes the episode more than a simple joke is how it ends. Patrick does finally receive a trophy. The trophy honors him, more or less, for having idled more thoroughly and more durably than any rival. And here is the moment that tells you everything about the difference between the two friends. Patrick takes this award, an award for stillness, an award for the absence of striving, and he immediately goes back under his rock to sleep, in order to protect the title. Hold the two images side by side, because the show is asking you to. SpongeBob wins Employee of the Month and is made anxious by it, driven back to work to defend a streak that only grows heavier. Patrick wins an award for doing nothing and is made content by it, drawn back under his rock to do exactly what he was already doing. Both are protecting a title, but one title demands endless labor and the other demands rest. For SpongeBob, the prize is a debt he must keep paying. For Patrick, the prize is permission to be what he already is. The same event, a trophy, means striving to one and acceptance to the other. This is why I think Hillenburg was careful about how much Patrick the show could hold on his own. He was asked, in effect, why Patrick never received a spin-off, and his answer drew the boundary clearly. The show is about SpongeBob, he said. SpongeBob is the core element, and the show is about how he relates to the other characters. Patrick by himself, he added, might be a bit too much. There is a real insight folded into that practical decision. Acceptance, pure and unstriving, does not generate a story. A character who wants nothing and defends the right to do nothing is beautiful as a foil and exhausting as a lead. Patrick works because he is measured against SpongeBob's wanting. Remove the wanting, and there is nothing for the calm to answer. So the two of them are locked together by design, the anxious innocent and the accepting one, and the show keeps returning them to a register beneath all of it, a register where the difference briefly stops mattering. Tom Kenny, who gives SpongeBob his voice, recalled how Hillenburg described the character to him. He said SpongeBob was half a child and half a grown-up, and he described the two friends, in effect, sometimes holding hands and skipping around together like 4-year-olds. That image is worth keeping as the light goes low. Underneath the streak of awards and the wall of trophies, underneath the anxiety of 26 becoming 27, there is a child who simply wants his friend beside him. The striving and the acceptance are not equals in the show's structure, and they were never meant to be. One is the engine, and one is the ballast. SpongeBob carries the ambition, the counting, the fear of the number climbing, all the restless energy that makes a story move. Patrick carries the answer to it, the reminder that a life can be measured by how long you have managed to rest, rather than how long you have managed to win. And when the two of them hold hands and skip, half child and half grown-up, the show lets you feel, for a moment, that neither of them has the whole of the truth, and that the friendship itself is the place where the two half-truths meet. Before the pink starfish existed, there was a football coach. On an American sitcom that ran through most of the 1990s, a show called Coach, Bill Fagerbakke played a man named Dauber Dubinsky, an assistant coach who was amiable and warm and not especially bright. Dauber was the sort of character who filled a room with goodwill and very little strategy, a large presence built around a small idea, and Fagerbakke played him for the better part of a decade. That is worth sitting with for a moment before we go anywhere near Bikini Bottom, because the man who would become the voice of Patrick Star did not arrive at that role as a blank slate. He arrived carrying a coach. He knew it too. During the early production of SpongeBob SquarePants, before the character had settled into the cultural fixture he would become, Fagerbakke privately gave Patrick a nickname of his own. He called him Aqua Dauber. It was a joke, but it was also an honest piece of self-observation, an actor noticing that the new part felt uncannily like the old one, that he had swum the same character down into the ocean and given him a starfish body. Think about what that nickname admits. It admits that Patrick did not feel, to the man voicing him, like an invention so much as a return. That sense of return runs through the whole shape of Fagerbakke's career, by his own telling. He stands 6 feet and 6 inches tall, and he has said plainly that his height typecast him, that he was steered again and again toward large, goofball characters, the big friendly body in the corner of the frame. When you are that size, the industry tends to decide what you are before you open your mouth. In a 2024 interview marking the show's 25th anniversary, he put the pattern into a single dry sentence. He said, and this is verbatim, "I've been playing characters of questionable intelligence, I guess, most of my life, and this was another one." There is no bitterness in that line. There is something closer to amusement, the tone of a man who long ago made peace with the lane he was given, and found it, in the end, a rather good lane to be in. What makes the remark more than a joke about typecasting is that Fagerbakke does not hold the character at arm's length. When an interviewer asked whether he personally relates to Patrick, he did not reach for the usual actor's deflection about craft and distance. He said, "I'm clumsy, I'm goofy, I make mistakes all the time." And then he agreed, in his own words, "I guess I'm a lot of Patrick." That is an unusual thing for a performer to confess. Most actors want you to know how far the role sits from the self, how much invention was required. Fagerbakke went the other direction. He closed the gap. He told you that the dim, easygoing creature you have been laughing at for years is not a costume he puts on and takes off, but a temperament he shares. The technique he uses to summon that temperament is almost comically simple, and the simplicity is the point. He has described the vocal method for Patrick this way: "I just kind of pretend my mouth is in my chest and I just slew down." Consider what that instruction actually does. Dropping the imagined source of the voice from the head to the chest lowers everything, thickens it, pulls the sound down and away from the quick, bright register where cleverness lives. And the slowing is not just a matter of pace. To slow the voice that much is to slow the thought behind it, to build in the sense that each word has to travel a long distance from wherever it began. Patrick sounds like someone whose sentences are arriving from far off, and that is because, in the actor's own image, They are being spoken from somewhere below the mind entirely. It is tempting to imagine that a performance this instinctive came easily from the first day, that Fagerbakke walked into the audition and simply knew what the part was. He has said the opposite. At the audition, Hillenburg played him a recording of Tom Kenny already performing SpongeBob, because Patrick's voice had been conceived from the start as a counterpoint, a low, steady thing built around the yellow sponge's higher, faster energy. Patrick was designed to answer a voice that already existed, and yet Fagerbakke, hearing that recording, could not find the thread. He remembered Hillenburg warmly, calling him, in his own words, such a lovely guy, but he admitted that he had absolutely no feeling for the material whatsoever. He said he couldn't pick that up from the audition material at all, that he was, in his phrase, just kind of perfunctorily trying to give the guy what he wanted. Let that land, because it complicates the easy story. One of the most recognizable voices in modern animation came out of an audition its owner barely understood, delivered by a man who felt nothing for the pages in front of him, and was simply, dutifully, trying to satisfy the person across the room. There is a moral buried in that, and it is not the flattering one about instant genius. It is that the fit between an actor and a character is sometimes discovered long after the hiring, that Fagerbakke did not recognize Patrick at the door, and only later realized, through years of work, how much of himself the part could hold. The recognition came backward. The aquadauber joke, the confession of clumsiness, the mouth in the chest technique, all of that is the sound of a man who found the character after he had already been cast as it. And when he did find it, what he reached for was not a bigger joke or a broader dumbness. It was honesty. Fagerbakke has said, describing his approach, "I always have to find that raw honesty of it to carry a lot of Patrick's stuff." That word, honesty, is a strange one to attach to a starfish who eats too much and thinks too little, and yet, it may be the single most useful key to why the character works at all. Patrick is not a collection of stupid lines. If he were only that, he would tire quickly, the way a one-note joke always does. What holds him together is that his stupidity is sincere. He is never winking at the audience, never signaling that somewhere underneath he understands more than he lets on. Whatever foolish thing he believes it completely, with his whole chest, and Fagerbakke's insistence on raw honesty is what keeps that belief from curdling into mere shtick. The dimness has to be felt, not performed, or it does not carry. Where does an adult actor find that quality of total, unembarrassed belief? Fagerbakke has told us where he looks. He draws on his own experience as a parent. He has described himself as always looking for opportunities to explore that freewheeling imagination and insanity of children, and that phrase reframes Patrick entirely. A child does not experience a wild idea as foolish. A child experiences it as obvious, as urgent, as the only reasonable thing in the world, and only later learns to be ashamed of it. What Fagerbakke is describing is an attempt to reach back into that state, to voice a creature who has all the freewheeling certainty of a small child and none of the eventual embarrassment. Patrick is not a stupid adult. Patrick is the imagination of a child, given a grown body and a slow, deep voice, released into a world that keeps expecting him to know better. The timing of his own life folds neatly into this. When SpongeBob SquarePants debuted in 1999, Fagerbakke's own daughters were still young enough that their world was not so different from Patrick's. They grew up alongside the show, which means the man voicing Patrick was, in those same years, living inside the very thing he says he draws upon, watching the freewheeling imagination of children, not as a memory, but as a daily fact of his household. He did not have to reconstruct that state of mind from somewhere distant. It was in the next room. The insanity of childhood he speaks of exploring was, during the show's formative seasons, the ordinary weather of his home, and it is not hard to hear some of that in the character, the sense that Patrick is voiced by someone who was, at that moment, surrounded by exactly the kind of logic Patrick lives by. So the portrait that assembles itself from these facts is quieter and stranger than the one you might expect. Not a comic genius conjuring an absurd voice from nothing, but a tall man who was always cast large and always cast simple, who carried a coach into the ocean and half-jokingly called him Aquadauber, who could not feel the part at the audition and found it only through years of patient work, who reaches for raw honesty and the imagination of his own young children to keep a foolish creature from becoming a cheap one, and who, when asked whether any of Patrick is really him, does not hesitate. He is clumsy. He is goofy. He makes mistakes all the time. He guesses he is a lot of Patrick, and by now, having listened this closely, you may guess the same. There is a moment in the episode Band Geeks, which first aired in September of 2001, in the second season, when Patrick raises a hand and asks Squidward whether mayonnaise is an instrument. The question is not answered kindly. It is dismissed, and that ought to have been the end of it. One throwaway line in an episode about a marching band, the kind of joke that lands and dissolves and is never thought of again. What happened instead is one of the stranger afterlives a cartoon line has ever had, and it is worth following slowly, because the shape of it tells you something about how a piece of comedy becomes something people treat as wisdom. Consider first what the line actually is. Patrick asks a sincere question that is also, on its face, absurd. He is not making a joke. Inside the world of the episode, he genuinely wants to know. That sincerity is the whole engine. A knowing wink would have died on the vine, but a character asking, in complete earnest, whether a condiment might be played like a clarinet has a peculiar staying power, because the listener is left holding the gap between the flat delivery and the ridiculous content. The humor lives in that gap, and so, it turns out, does the meme. The migration outward began quietly. In November of 2009, a Facebook page was created with the title, "Is Mayonnaise an Instrument?" And over the next several years, it gathered more than 24,000 people who chose to attach their name to it. Weigh that as an act. Liking a page is small, but it is a small public declaration, a way of saying that this line belongs to you now, that you are the kind of person who finds it funny. Thousands of people made that declaration about a single sentence from a cartoon Starfish. Then the line began to be documented as if it were a word in the language. In November of 2011, Urban Dictionary added an entry defining mayonnaise as, in effect, something that is not an instrument. That is a curious thing to happen to a food. The definition is a joke, of course, but it is a joke that requires the reader to already know the source, and the fact that it could be written at all means the writer assumed a shared understanding. The condiment had acquired a second meaning that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with a single scene. The clip itself spread through the ordinary machinery of the early video internet. Around 2010, a YouTube user uploaded the scene as its own short video, and by most accounts, that upload alone went on to gather several 100,000 views over the years that followed. People were seeking the moment out on purpose, isolated from the episode around it, watching the question and its dismissal over and over. And where a clip travels, the remixers follow. In December of 2011, someone uploaded a dubstep remix of the scene, chopping the line into a piece of music, which is a small and perfect irony, given that the joke turns on the idea that this thing could never be musical at all. The decisive development, though, was structural. The line stopped being a quotation and became a template. Users kept the deadpan question and its rhythm intact, kept the earnest raised hand, and swapped mayonnaise for some other absurd and unrelated object of their choosing. That is the moment a piece of comedy stops being a reference and becomes a tool. You no longer need to invoke Patrick to use the joke. You need only borrow his cadence, the flat, sincere inquiry into whether some ordinary thing might secretly belong to a category it plainly does not. The scene had become a grammar. And then, years later, reality bent toward the joke instead of away from it. In 2026, the mayonnaise brand Hellmann's reportedly published research carried out with an academic at Northumbria University who specializes in music technology, and the research is said to have reached a conclusion that Patrick would have found entirely reasonable. Measured against the standards of organology and acoustics, and specifically against the Hornbostel sax system that classifies the instruments of the world, mayonnaise qualifies as a musical instrument. To make the point concrete, a musician reportedly recorded a track using nothing but mayonnaise to produce the sound. There is a real strangeness to that. A question posed as the height of foolishness, dismissed within its own scene, was taken up 2.5 decades later by an actual academic and answered in the affirmative. The joke was that the answer was obviously no. The joke curdled into a maybe, and then into a yes. There is something to be learned from that arc, and it is not really about mayonnaise. It is about how the internet treats deadpan sincerity. Patrick's question survived because it refused to signal that it was a joke, and that refusal is exactly the quality online culture came to prize. The line reads as absurdist, and it reads as wisdom, precisely because it will not tell you which it is. It leaves the judgment to you. A great deal of what people call meme humor is this same move, a flat, earnest statement of something ridiculous, delivered without the safety of a punchline, and Patrick was one of the earliest and purest carriers of it. He was not the only line from the show to make this journey. Around 2007, another Patrick moment began circulating as a meme, this one drawn from the episode Sandy, SpongeBob and the Worm, which aired in October of 2001. The format that grew from it, known as Push It Somewhere Else Patrick, is built on a snow clone, a fill-in-the-blank sentence of the form let us take something and put it somewhere else. Like the mayonnaise line, it works by offering a structure rather than a fixed joke. The user supplies the specifics. What both formats share is Patrick as the face of a particular kind of confidently wrong reasoning, the character who proposes a solution that solves nothing and states it as though it were obvious. People kept reaching for him whenever they wanted to name that exact flavor of misplaced certainty. While the memes were spreading through Facebook pages and remixes and definition sites, something quieter was happening in a different corner of the culture. In 2011, the same year the Urban Dictionary entry appeared, the publisher Open Court released an academic book titled SpongeBob SquarePants and Philosophy, Soaking Up Secrets Under the Sea. It arrived as the 60th volume in the publisher's long-running popular culture and philosophy series, edited by Joseph Foy, a series that treats works of popular entertainment as legitimate occasions for serious philosophical thought. The show had crossed a threshold, no longer only a thing to quote, it had become a thing to teach with. The chapters take the show at its word. One of them, written by Timothy Dunn, uses the episode Patrick Smartpants to introduce the hedonistic utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill, and in particular, Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Patrick, in his ordinary form, is a creature of simple pleasures, and Dunn sets those against the higher pleasures of the mind that Mill thought carried greater worth. The comedy of the episode becomes a way into one of the oldest arguments in moral philosophy, whether all pleasures are equal, or whether some are richer than others. Patrick, of all characters, is the specimen on the table. Another chapter turns to Aristotle, and makes the case that SpongeBob himself embodies a life of well-being and flourishing, the condition the ancient Greeks called the good and complete life, the thing every action is ultimately for. It is a generous reading, and a plausible one, because SpongeBob's relentless delight in small tasks does resemble the Aristotelian idea that a flourishing life is one lived fully in accordance with one's own nature. And a third chapter, written by Katie Anderson, uses the episode Sleepy Time to raise the questions that Descartes made famous, the questions about dreams and reality, about how you can be certain that what you are experiencing is real and not the elaborate fabric of a dream. These are the doubts that sit at the foundation of modern philosophy, and a cartoon about a sponge who visits the dreams of his neighbors turns out to be a workable place to begin asking them. Put the two histories side by side, and the picture completes itself. On one side, the memes, spreading through likes and uploads and remixes, turning Patrick's earnest foolishness into a shared language, and eventually provoking a real scientist to concede the point. On the other, the philosophers, taking the same show and using its episodes to teach Mill and Aristotle and Descartes to students who arrived expecting neither. Both are forms of the same recognition. A children's cartoon and a starfish who is not especially bright produced lines and moments that a culture decided were worth keeping, worth defining, worth arguing over, worth putting to the test. The deadpan question that was meant to be dismissed outlived the dismissal. It became a template, then a study, and finally, against every expectation, an answer. Across the chapters that came before this one, a single question kept returning under different names. What does it mean to be content? And why does a starfish who wants almost nothing seem to have found something that the rest of Bikini Bottom, and the rest of us, keep chasing and losing? This closing chapter does not add new evidence. It gathers what has already been laid down and holds it up to the light one last time, slowly, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your hand before setting it aside for the night. Begin far from the ocean, in ancient China, with an idea called Wu Wei, The phrase comes from the Tao Te Ching and from the writings of Zhuangzi, and it is usually rendered as non-doing or non-action, though neither translation is quite right. Wu Wei does not mean laziness, and it does not mean giving up. It means aligning your actions with the natural flow of life, rather than forcing against it or resisting it. Think of water, which the Taoists loved as an image. Water does not strain to reach the sea. It simply follows the shape of the ground and arrives anyway. There is a kind of person who moves through the world like that, who does not seem to be trying and yet somehow never seems to be failing either. You already have a face in mind for that description, and it is round and pink and untroubled. The same tradition draws a quiet line between simplicity and peace. The Tao Te Ching teaches, in effect, that letting go of unnecessary attachments and unnecessary desires is what allows contentment to settle into the present moment. Notice the word unnecessary, because it is doing careful work. The teaching is not that you should want nothing. It is that most of what we want is extra, added on, borrowed from other people's eyes, and that each thing we release makes the present a little lighter and a little more habitable. Contentment, in this view, is not something you build. It is something that appears once you stop building. Move west now, and forward in time, to the garden of Epicurus. Here the goal has a name of its own, ataraxia, which means a state of tranquility, a freedom from mental disturbance. For Epicurus, this calm was not a consolation prize. It was the highest form of happiness a person could reach. And he was practical about how to reach it. He sorted human desires into three kinds. There are desires that are natural and necessary, like food and shelter and the company of friends. There are desires that are natural but unnecessary, like an elaborate feast when plain bread would do. And there are desires that are neither natural nor necessary, like fame or power or wealth for its own sake. His teaching was almost startling in its plainness. Satisfy the first kind, the natural and necessary, and you have very nearly everything a contented life requires. The rest is weight. Epicurus went further, and made a distinction that repays a slow reading late at night. He separated fleeting pleasures from what he called katastematic pleasures, the static or settled ones. A fleeting pleasure is the spike of getting the thing you wanted. A katastematic pleasure is the calm that arises when your desires are already satisfied, when there is nothing left to reach for in this particular moment. Epicurus considered the settled kind superior, and his reasoning is worth sitting with. Fleeting pleasures generate new cravings. Each one leaves you wanting the next. The calm of a satisfied desire generates nothing. It simply is, and because it asks for nothing more, it can last. That distinction, between the pleasure that hooks you and the pleasure that lets you rest, may be the whole quiet argument of this video in a single line. Then there is the Stoic contribution, and here the voice belongs to Epictetus, who was once a slave and later a teacher, and whose small handbook, the Enchiridion, still fits in a coat pocket. Epictetus taught that the world divides cleanly into two categories. Some things are within our power, and some things are not. Within our power are our opinions, our motivations, our desires, our aversions, the movements of our own inner life. Not within our power are our bodies, our property, our reputation, the whole outer world that other people and blind chance keep rearranging. Peace of mind, he said in effect, comes from focusing only on the first category and releasing our grip on the second. This is called the dichotomy of control, and it is a strangely gentle idea once you feel the shape of it. So much of our suffering is the effort of trying to command things that were never ours to command. Set them down, and a great deal of noise goes quiet. For the sharpest image of all this, the ancient world offers Diogenes of Sinope, the cynic, who did not merely argue for simple living, but performed it in the middle of a marketplace. Diogenes lived in a large ceramic jar, a pithos, in the marketplace of Corinth. He owned a cloak, a staff, and a wallet, and almost nothing besides, and this was not poverty forced upon him but luxury deliberately refused. He had looked at what other people spent their lives acquiring, and had decided, calmly and completely, that he did not want it. And the most famous moment attributed to him carries the whole philosophy in a handful of words. According to accounts by ancient writers, among them Plutarch, Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world, came and stood before Diogenes and offered him anything he wished for. Diogenes, lying in the sun, answered only, "Stand out of my sunlight." He wanted nothing the emperor could give, because he already had what he valued, and what he valued was the sun on his skin and the freedom of the present moment. Freedom and present contentment, he was saying in effect, outweigh wealth and power, and the man who wants nothing cannot be bought. These are old voices, separated by centuries and by whole oceans of language, and yet they keep arriving at the same shore: simplicity. The letting go of unnecessary desire, the calm that does not generate new hunger, the grip loosened on what was never ours. It would be easy to treat this agreement as merely poetic, until you reach the strangest fact of all, which comes not from philosophy, but from a laboratory. In 1971, the psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell described something they called the hedonic treadmill. Their observation was that the happiness we gain from good events and the happiness we lose from bad ones tends to fade over time, because we drift back toward a baseline, a set point that is roughly our own. And in their research, they found the evidence in two extremes. People who had won the lottery felt a surge of happiness that faded as the months passed. People who had been paralyzed in accidents fell into misery, and yet their happiness too eventually returned toward the baseline they had lived at before. And that is the modern world quietly confirming the ancient one. The lottery does not make you lasting happy. The catastrophe does not make you lasting unhappy. The outer event, the thing Epicurus placed outside our control, moves the needle and then releases it, and we return to ourselves. Which is to say that chasing the next acquisition is running on a belt that carries you nowhere, exactly as Epicurus warned when he named the pleasures that breed new cravings. The treadmill is the hedonic trap drawn as a graph. And the way off it is to step down, to want a little less, to notice that the baseline you keep returning to is where your life actually happens. Running faster only keeps the belt moving. So the starfish, who owns little and reaches for almost nothing, is not simply foolish, and the show may have known that all along. He is not on the treadmill because he never stepped onto it. What he wants is the natural and the necessary, the sun and the quiet and the friend nearby, and having those, he rests in the settled pleasure of a satisfied moment, asking for no more. Whether it is wisdom or accident hardly matters now, at this hour. What matters is the shape it leaves behind, the same shape the Taoist drew in water, and Epictetus drew in his handbook, and Diogenes drew simply by lying in the sun. Contentment was never the thing you finally get. It was the thing that was here the whole time, once you stopped needing it to be somewhere else. Patrick Starr asks for nothing. That is the thing to hold on to, the quiet center of everything considered here. He does not strive or accumulate, and he never measures the shape of his life against the shape of anyone else's. Where the rest of Bikini Bottom runs toward money and status and the approval of others, Patrick simply rests inside his own being, and the series never once punishes him for it. Follow that through. A character who wants nothing cannot be disappointed, cannot be diminished, cannot be made small by a world that keeps insisting he should want more. His contentment is not stupidity dressed up as peace. It is a refusal, gentle and complete, of the idea that a person must earn the right to exist. The philosophy that lives under the rock is not an argument to be won. It is a way of being that most of us abandoned somewhere along the way, and that Patrick never learned to abandon at all. He is happy because he has never agreed to be anything other than what he is. And so the image to leave you with is the simplest one: a pink starfish, asleep beneath a stone at the bottom of the sea, breathing slow, wanting nothing, needing nothing, at rest in a world that never taught him to be afraid of stillness. The tide moves above him, he does not. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.